He was warned. Every person in that room heard it. And Ryu Jae-hun made Gong Se-won bleed anyway. The blood was still crossing Se-won's forearm when Elizabeth moved. She didn't run, she didn't scream, she didn't look for security, for an exit, or for her husband's permission. She set down her champagne glass with the particular calm of someone removing an obstacle from her hands, and she crossed that grand hall in a navy gown the color of deep water. Lace across her shoulders, a slit that turned the dress from elegant to lethal with each long stride. And 300 people in black tie watched her arrive at a conclusion Ryu Jae-hun had not yet reached. She gripped him by the collar. She brought him down to his knees on that marble floor beneath the chandelier light. Her hands, already stained red from where she'd pressed them instinctively to her husband's wound, held him with the grip of someone who has done far worse and chosen not to. Then she spoke, in Korean, flawless, cold, surgical Korean that Se-won had never once heard her use in 2 years of marriage. I told you not to make him bleed. The room went absolutely still. 30 seconds. That was all it took. Ryu Jae-hun had entered that dinner with a blade and a vendetta. He left it on his knees, hollowed out, publicly dismantled by a woman his world had classified as decorative. Gong Se-won stood frozen behind them, glass arrested in his hand, sleeve dark with his own blood, watching his wife dismantle a dangerous man with nothing but language and understanding, with the specific, irreversible clarity of a man whose entire reality has just shifted, that he had no idea who he married. Before we go any further into Elizabeth's world, I need to stop and see you. You chose this story out of everything available to you today, and that is not something I take lightly. Tell me in the comments where you are right now, what city, what country, what corner of the world brought you here. Every name matters to me. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand who these two people were before the blood and before the truth. 2 years before the blood, there was a transaction. Elizabeth J. Ball had spent 11 years reading people for a living, mapping the architecture of deception, tracing the fault lines in a liar's composure, building behavioral profiles that put violent men in federal custody. She was, by every internal metric the Bureau tracked, exceptional. She documented what she found, she filed what she knew, and when what she knew reached high enough up the chain of command, the Bureau thanked her by erasing her, quietly, methodically, and completely. No hearing, no appeal, just a record that said she was unstable, a clearance that evaporated overnight, and a list of powerful men who would make certain she didn't land anywhere soft. She left the country with one bag and a private attorney's business card. Gong Se-won had inherited his father's empire at 28 and spent the 6 years since dismantling it with one hand while running it with the other. The open violence, the blunt instrument operations, the loyalty maintained through fear, he was removing all of it, piece by piece, building something leaner and colder in its place, an information architecture, an influence network, the kind of power that didn't announce itself. His council, men who had served his father and buried 3 of his father's enemies, read this as weakness. They had been deciding what to do about it for nearly 2 years. What Se-won needed was cover, a foreign wife, American, presentable, politically neutral, created precisely the impression he required, a man integrating into legitimate international circles, unthreatening, modernizing, domestic. What Elizabeth needed was a name that wouldn't surface in any American database in a country where her former superiors had no reach. The attorney introduced them on a Tuesday. By Friday, the paperwork was filed. The penthouse they shared was large enough to be a country with 2 citizens who had agreed wordlessly never to cross into each other's territory. Gong Si-won worked, Elizabeth attended dinners and gowns that cost more than her last government salary, smiled at the appropriate moments, and spoke careful, minimal English to people who expected nothing more from her. She understood every word spoken around her from the third week onward. She told no one. Silence, she had learned, was the only currency that didn't get traced. They were, by every visible measure, strangers who shared an address. Elizabeth had decided that was exactly how it needed to stay. She heard him stop outside her door at 11:43. She knew it was him by the particular quality of the silence. Se-won moved through the penthouse the way he moved through every room, without announcement, without apology. But he had never stopped at her door before. In 2 years, he had never once stood on that side of it. His voice, when it came, was quiet and without inflection. A single word in Korean. How long? Elizabeth set down the book she hadn't been reading. She crossed the room and opened the door. He stood in the hallway in a white dress shirt with the sleeve cut away, his forearm bandaged with the clean, efficient wrapping of a man who had dressed his own wounds before. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued across 2 years of dinners and functions, controlled, legible only in its edges, but something in the architecture of it had shifted. He was recalibrating. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself once, when a case file told her something she hadn't been prepared to know. She answered him in Korean, unhurried, unashamed. Since the 3rd week, she said. She told him about the bureau, what she had been, what she had found, and what it had cost her. She told him about the erasure, the year of running, the attorney's business card that became a country and a name and a door she could close behind her. She told him why she had hidden the language, because useful silence was the only kind of power she had left, and she had learned to protect it. Then she told him about Ryu. She walked him through it the way she had walked prosecutors through a profile, methodical, precise, without editorializing. Ryu's behavioral pattern over 18 months, the specific psychological signature of a man whose obsession had curdled into something operational. The dinner had not been impulsive, it had been an opening move, and opening moves, she said, had architects. Se-won was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if she was willing to stop pretending. She told him she was willing to be useful. He looked at her steadily, and when he spoke, his voice was even, but the question underneath it was not. That isn't what I asked. She sat in the corner of the council room and said nothing. This, Se-won had told them, was his wife observing quarterly operations as part of her transition into a formal advisory role. 3 of the 11 men at that table had objected before he finished the sentence. He had not acknowledged the objections. Elizabeth had taken her seat, folded her hands, and watched. She did not take notes. She did not need to. Within the first session, she had baselines on all 11, vocal cadence under low stress, default posture, the specific geometry of how each man arranged himself when he felt secure. By the end of the second meeting, she had their patterns under pressure, who contracted, who performed, who went very still and watchful in the way of men accustomed to surviving rooms like this one. By the end of the second week, she had 3 names. She came to Se-won's study at midnight and set the documents on his desk. There were no accusations in them. There were behavioral timelines, communication frequency analyses, documented shifts in proxemic behavior across 14 meetings she had reconstructed from Syndicate records. There were micro-expression logs from her own observation, cross-referenced against the moments in each session where specific information had been presented, information that subsequently moved. The 3 profiles were dense, precise, and damning without containing a single speculative word. Se-won read them without speaking. She watched him work through each page with the methodical attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, and the particular stillness that settled over him told her he had already suspected one of the names. The other 2 were new. He closed the last folder and looked up. He asked her how she did it, read 11 men that completely, across 2 weeks, without any of them knowing they were being read at all. Elizabeth considered the question the way she considered all questions, briefly, from several angles, for what it actually meant. Everyone reveals themselves, she said. They can't help it. The concealment is visible if you know where to look. Most people don't look past the surface because the surface is usually enough. She paused. You look past it. That's why you're still running this organization when 3 of those men have been trying to take it from you for months. Something crossed Sewon's face that she had not seen there before. She didn't profile it. Not yet. The story broke on a Thursday morning, which told her it was planned. Improvised leaks arrived at odd hours, whenever the source was frightened and moving fast. Coordinated ones surfaced at the beginning of the news cycle, timed for maximum propagation. Elizabeth read the article on her phone at the kitchen island before Sewon was awake and understood, with professional detachment, that someone had spent real money on the fabrication. The documents were good. The sourcing was layered. A less practiced eye would not have found the seams. She was making coffee when the 3 council members arrived at 9. She watched them from the hallway. Sewon had not asked her to leave, and she had not offered to, as they laid out their position with the careful courtesy of men delivering an ultimatum they believed was generous. Distance himself from his wife publicly and completely. Issue a statement. Allow them to manage the narrative. They were, they implied, giving him a path through this. They were giving him the chance to survive it intact, provided he was willing to hand her over first. Sewon listened without expression until they finished. Then he thanked them for coming and showed them out. He found her on the balcony 20 minutes later. Seoul spread below them in its gray morning light, unhurried and enormous. He stood beside her without touching the railing and looked at the city the way she had seen him look at documents, as though he was reading something most people couldn't see. He asked her what she would do if the organization were hers and the problem were him. Elizabeth set down her coffee. She would not distance herself, she said. Distance confirmed the story. Distance was exactly the move they had designed this to force, because a man who sacrificed his wife under pressure was a man whose counsel had just learned exactly how to control him. She would walk into the next full session with him beside her. She would give her the floor, and she would let the room watch what happened when the foreign intelligence operative they had manufactured opened her mouth in front of 11 men who thought they already knew what she was. Sewon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is what I would do." It was the first time they had stood on the same side of something. Neither of them remarked on it, but neither of them moved away. Sewon walked in first. Elizabeth walked in beside him. Not behind, not at a careful distance, beside. Close enough that the room understood it was deliberate, that this was a position he had chosen for her, that the choice was not negotiable. He took his seat at the head of the table and introduced her in 4 sentences. Her name, her title, her role going forward. Advisor to his office, effective immediately. The objection came before he finished. All 3 of them, voices overlapping, citing the article, the documentation, the untenable optics of an American operative sitting inside Syndicate operations. One of them used the word liability. Another used the word compromised. The third looked directly at Sewon and said this was precisely the situation the confidence measure had been designed for. Sewon let them finish. Then he turned to Elizabeth and said in Korean that the floor was hers. She stood. She had spent 11 years in rooms like this one. Different cities, different languages, the same fundamental architecture of men who believed they were unreadable. She opened the first folder and began. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She moved through the evidence the way she had always moved through evidence, chronologically, precisely, without affect, and the room went progressively, visibly quieter as the men inside it understood what they were listening to. communication logs between the three principals, time-stamped across 9 months, financial transfers routed through 2 intermediaries she had traced to accounts the syndicate's own auditors had never flagged, behavioral documentation from 16 council sessions, annotated with the specific moments where information exchanged in that room had subsequently surfaced where it should not have, and finally 3 profiles, 1 per man, clinical, thorough, and delivered in her clearest Korean, which she could see was its own particular devastation. By the 20th minute, 2 of the 8 uninvolved council members had physically shifted their chairs. By the 30th, 1 of the 3 principals had stopped meeting anyone's eyes. By the 40th, the room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. She closed the final folder and sat down. The 3 men said nothing. There was nothing available to them. She had not accused them with opinions. She had simply described them, completely and in public, and let the description do what descriptions did when they were accurate. Everyone in that room now understood what she had been in every meeting for months. The foreign wife had been the most dangerous person at the table. The penthouse was quiet in the way it always was after operational work. A specific silence, the kind that followed decisions that could not be unmade. Sawan poured 2 glasses and set one on the counter near her without comment. Elizabeth picked it up. They stood in the kitchen in the particular wordless ease that had developed between them over the past weeks, the ease of 2 people who had been working toward the same thing long enough that proximity no longer required justification. He asked the question without preamble, the way he asked all questions. "Why did you stay?" She looked at him. He continued, quietly. The arrangement had served its purpose within the first 8 months. She was stable, unfindable, protected. She could have approached any number of dissolution structures that would have left her intact and free. She had not. He had reviewed the timeline. She had stayed, and he wanted to know why. Elizabeth set down her glass. She understood, with the clinical clarity that was both her greatest asset and the thing that had cost her more than anything else, that she had an answer. She had known the answer for some time. The problem was that saying it aloud would make it a fact that existed between them, and facts between people like them had weight and consequence, and the specific kind of vulnerability she had spent 3 years engineering her life to avoid. She told him she needed more time with the question. Then she walked out of the kitchen. She made it to the building's rooftop access, 17 floors above the penthouse, which she had discovered in the first month and never told him about. The city was enormous and indifferent below her. She stood in the cold and did not profile herself out of what she was feeling, which was the closest thing to honesty she had managed in years. She heard the door behind her open 18 minutes later. Sawan had never, in his life, gone after anyone who walked away from him. She knew this because she had built his profile with the same thoroughness she applied to everyone. It was one of the fixed points of his character, a pride so old it had become architecture. He stood beside her without speaking. She did not tell him to go back inside. They stayed there until the cold became unreasonable, and then they went back down together, and she did not leave the penthouse, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. She had been tracking Ryu Jae-hyun the way she tracked all subjects, quietly, at a distance, through the behavioral residue he left in the systems he believed were private. His profile had been straightforward from the beginning, escalating obsession with a persecution narrative at its center, grandiosity increasing in direct proportion to his isolation, and a confirmation bias so well developed that he had long since stopped seeing evidence and started seeing only verification. He believed he was the protagonist of something. Men like Ryu always did. It made them readable. It also made them useful. She identified his back channel in the 3rd week, a communication thread routed through 2 intermediaries that he believed was untraceable, which it nearly was. Nearly was enough. She spent 4 days building the fabricated intelligence package with the same precision she had once applied to federal case files, sourcing layered to match what his faction handlers had trained him to recognize as credible, language calibrated to his specific epistemic vulnerabilities, structured to look exactly like the documentation he had been told to find. She sent the first piece on a Tuesday. She watched him receive it through the behavioral indicators she had mapped across his network: response latency, downstream communication spikes, the specific pattern of a man who believes he has just found what he was looking for. She sent the second piece 4 days later. By the end of the second week, Ryu Jae-hyun was building toward a conclusion she had written for him, certain he was the one holding the pen. She told Se-won on a Wednesday evening, across his desk, with the behavioral timeline open between them. 10 days, she said. He will surface publicly at an event with witnesses and visibility, carrying what he believes is the evidence to dismantle you. He needs an audience. His profile requires it. The grandiosity won't allow for anything quieter. Se-won studied the timeline. He asked her what the documentation would actually contain when Ryu opened it in public. Everything, she said. Every communication between the faction principals, every financial transfer, every coordination record from the attack at the dinner, traced back to the men who authorized it, assembled, sourced, and delivered through Ryu's own hands, in front of cameras, to an audience of witnesses. She closed the folder. She told him she wanted to be in the room when Ryu realized what he was holding. Ryu Jae-hyun arrived at the gala 40 minutes after it opened, which she had anticipated, late enough to let the room fill, early enough to control the moment. Elizabeth tracked him from across the ballroom without moving toward him. She watched him work his way through the perimeter, clocking the cameras, positioning himself with the instinctive stagecraft of a man who had been rehearsing this for weeks. He was dressed well. He was composed. He had the particular brightness in his bearing of someone carrying something they believed was explosive, and he did not look at her once, which told her he didn't know she was already in the room. Se-won was beside her. She touched his arm once, briefly, and he stilled. She watched Ryu reach the cluster of journalists she had identified as his intended audience, 2 investigative reporters and a camera operator, positioned exactly where a well-placed anonymous tip 3 days ago had suggested they might find something significant. She watched him produce the documentation with the careful drama of a man who had been waiting a long time for this. She watched the reporters begin to read. She watched Ryu's face as they read. The composure held for approximately 40 seconds. Then something behind his eyes began to shift. A subtle recalibration, pages turning faster now, the reporters exchanging glances that were not the glances he had expected. Not alarm at Se-won's exposure. Something else. Something that looked from across a ballroom very much like the expression of people reading names they recognized. He looked up. His eyes moved through the room with the desperate scanning quality of a man whose footing has just disappeared beneath him. They found her. She was already walking toward him. She crossed the room the way she had crossed it the first time, without hurry, without announcement, and stopped close enough that what she said next would not carry. His face, at proximity, was a complete profile. Shock, humiliation, and beneath both of those, the dawning and absolute comprehension of a man who understood he had built his own collapse and handed it to witnesses with his own hands. She spoke quietly. "You were always just a file to me," she said, "and I closed you." She straightened and walked back to Se-won. Behind her, Ryu Jae-hyun did not fight. He did not argue. He simply stopped. Whatever had been animating him these 3 years, guttering out in real time, in public, in front of cameras, and folded. The arrests began within the hour. The council room had been reorganized. New faces at the table where 3 chairs sat empty, new alignments visible in the way men positioned themselves relative to one another. Siwon stood at the front of it in a dark suit and introduced Elizabeth the way he did everything, without preamble, without performance, without asking the room's permission. Her name, her background, which he stated without euphemism, her title within the organization, which he had created for her and which had no precedent in the syndicate structure because there had never been anyone to fill it. Her role going forward, described in 4 precise sentences that left no interpretive room. Not a cultural liaison, not a foreign accessory, his partner and chief strategic advisor, whose counsel carried the weight of his own. She stood beside him in the navy gown, the same one, the one that had been present at the beginning of all of this, with the statement necklace catching the chandelier light and her hair swept up in its clean, commanding line. She looked at the room with the expression she had decided sometime in the past weeks was the only one she owed them. Composed, clear-eyed, completely present. Siwon reached over and took her hand. It was a small gesture. It lasted only a moment, but she felt the room register it, the particular stillness of people witnessing something from a man they believed incapable of it, and she did not pull away. She let him, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. Later, the balcony, Seoul below them in its infinite lit sprawl, the city indifferent and enormous as it always was. He asked her, quietly, without pressure, the same question he had asked in the kitchen weeks ago, on the night she had walked out rather than answer it incomplete. She looked at the city for a moment. Then she told him. It wasn't long, 3 sentences, maybe 4, but they were true in the specific, unhedged way she had spent 3 years avoiding, and she felt the truth of them settle between them without apology. Siwon pulled her against him without speaking. His hand was warm at her back. The city moved below them, unhurried and vast. Elizabeth J. Ball, who had arrived in Korea with 1 bag and a need to disappear, stood in it fully. No file, no profile, no mask. Just this. You made it to the end, and I want you to know I felt that. Stories like this one don't just ask you to listen, they ask you to feel something you maybe haven't let yourself feel in a while. If Elizabeth's journey moved something in you, leave it in the comments. 1 word, 1 sentence, whatever it is. I will read it, because every comment is a person, and every person who finds their way to this channel becomes part of something bigger than a single story. Subscribe if you want to stay, like if it landed, and come back soon, because the next story is already written, already waiting, and it begins exactly where the quiet gets dangerous.